There's a photograph in the Yale Medical School archives that psychology students are required to examine during their ethics training. The photograph, taken in 1887, shows 34 teenagers standing in perfect rows outside a grand brick building. They wear identical gray uniforms. Their posture is rigid, militaristic, but it's their faces that disturb viewers most. Every single expression is identical. Blank, emotionless, eyes focused on nothing. They look less like students and more like carefully manufactured products awaiting quality inspection. Beneath the photograph, a caption reads, "Holloway Academy for Wayward Youth, Class of 1887, successfully corrected." What successfully corrected actually meant wouldn't be fully understood until 1901, when the daughter of the Academy's founder walked into the Connecticut state legislature with a box of documents that would expose one of the most systematic cases of child abuse disguised as scientific progress in American history. This is the story of the Holloway method, the man who created it, the children who survived it, and the question that still haunts modern psychology. How many other experiments like this occurred behind closed doors, their records destroyed, their victims silenced forever? Before we begin, please leave a comment with your location and the time you're watching. We want to know how far these documented accounts reach and at what hours people seek out these darker chapters of history. Dr. Edmund Holloway was born in 1829 to a prosperous New Haven family. He attended Yale University, then Yale Medical School, graduating in 1853 with a focus on what was then called mental science, the study of the mind and behavior. During his medical training, Holloway became obsessed with a question that would define his life's work. Could human personality be deliberately reshaped through scientific intervention? The prevailing medical wisdom of the time suggested that personality and behavior were largely fixed, determined by heredity and early childhood experiences. But Holloway believed otherwise. He was convinced that with the right techniques, with sufficient control over a person's environment, any behavior could be modified, any personality could be remolded. He wasn't interested in treating the mentally ill. He was interested in something far more ambitious, creating a method to transform undesirable people into desirable ones. By the 1860s, Holloway had developed what he called the reconstruction theory. The theory posited that human personality was like a building. If the foundation was flawed, you couldn't simply repair it. You had to tear the structure down to its foundation and rebuild from scratch. In human terms, this meant systematically destroying a person's existing personality and then reconstructing it according to a predetermined ideal. This theory attracted attention in certain academic circles, though many of Holloway's colleagues found his ideas disturbingly extreme. But Holloway had something his critics lacked: funding. In 1866, he married Catherine Fairchild, the daughter of a wealthy industrialist. Catherine's father, impressed by Holloway's confidence and vision, provided substantial financial backing for his son-in-law's ambitious plans. In 1867, using his father-in-law's money, Holloway purchased a 50-acre estate outside Hartford, Connecticut. On that property, he constructed a grand brick building designed to his precise specifications. It had 3 floors. The ground floor contained classrooms and dining facilities. The second floor housed dormitories. The third floor, accessible only by a locked stairway, contained what Holloway called the reconstruction chambers. In October 1867, Holloway Academy for Wayward Youth officially opened for enrollment. The Academy's marketing was brilliant. Holloway positioned his school as a solution for wealthy families with a common problem: children who didn't conform to societal expectations. Rebellious daughters who rejected traditional female roles. Effeminate sons who showed no interest in manly pursuits. Children who questioned authority, showed artistic temperaments, or simply couldn't be controlled by conventional discipline. Holloway promised these families that he could correct these deviations, that through his scientific method he could transform their difficult children into ideal citizens. The price was steep, $500 per year, equivalent to about $10,000 today. But for families desperate to avoid the shame of a wayward child, the cost was worth it. Applications flooded in. By January 1868, Holloway Academy had its first class of 12 students, ages 12 to 16. What happened to those children over the following months would set a pattern that would continue for over 3 decades. The Holloway method, as it came to be known, operated in 4 phases, each designed to break down and rebuild human personality. Phase 1 was assessment. New students spent their first week in complete isolation in one of the third-floor chambers. These rooms were approximately 8 feet by 10 feet, contained only a bed and a chamber pot, and had no windows. Students were provided with adequate food but no human contact. They were told this was to allow them to contemplate their failures before beginning reconstruction. In reality, this isolation served multiple purposes. It disoriented students, made them desperate for human contact, and established from the beginning that the academy operated by rules completely different from anything they had experienced before. During this week, Holloway would observe students through a small viewing slot in each door, documenting their reactions to isolation. Students who became hysterical were noted as highly resistant. Students who became withdrawn were noted as malleable. These observations guided how each student would be processed through the subsequent phases. Phase 2 was deconstruction. This phase could last anywhere from 2 months to over a year, depending on how long it took to break a student's existing personality. The techniques used in this phase were systematic and brutal. Students were subjected to constant criticism. Everything about them was declared wrong: their manner of speaking, their posture, their interests, their thoughts, their very identity. They were told repeatedly that they were fundamentally defective, that their previous life had been a failure, that they had to be completely remade to have any value. Sleep deprivation was used extensively. Students were woken at irregular hours, sometimes multiple times per night, for correction sessions, where they were required to confess their faults and recite the principles of proper behavior. Any resistance, any defense of their previous self resulted in punishment. Punishment at Holloway Academy took several forms. The mildest was public humiliation during assembly, where a student would stand before their peers while Holloway or a senior staff member detailed their failures. More severe was isolation, returning students to the third-floor chambers for days or weeks, with even more restricted food than during the assessment phase. The most severe punishment was called the silence treatment. Students subjected to this were forbidden to speak to anyone, and other students were forbidden to acknowledge their existence. This could last for months. Staff would refer to the silent student only as the invisible one. Other students were required to step around them as though they weren't there. Meals were left on the floor like for an animal. This treatment was psychologically devastating. Students would beg, after weeks of this, to be allowed to exist again, to be acknowledged as human beings. Phase 3 was reconstruction. Once a student had been sufficiently broken, showing complete submission to authority and rejection of their previous identity, they were ready for rebuilding. Reconstruction involved intensive conditioning. Students were taught exactly how to think, speak, move, and feel. They attended classes up to 14 hours per day. The curriculum had nothing to do with traditional education. Instead, students learned the principles of proper living. Holloway's personally developed doctrine on how people should behave. They memorized these principles until they could recite them instantly. They practiced proper posture, proper tone of voice, proper emotional responses. Importantly, they were taught to suppress any trace of their deviant characteristics. A girl who had been too independent learned to defer to male authority. A boy who had been sensitive learned to display only approved masculine emotions. A child who had questioned authority learned never to think for themselves again. The reconstruction phase was considered complete when a student could perform these approved behaviors automatically without thought, when the conditioning had become so deep that the student genuinely believed they had been saved from their previous defective self. Phase 4 was integration. Students who had been successfully reconstructed were given privileged status in the academy. They were allowed more freedoms, better food, and most importantly, they were made into enforcers of the system. Reconstructed students were used to monitor newer students, to report any backsliding, to deliver punishments to those who resisted. This created a self-perpetuating system where victims became perpetrators, where students who had survived the method now helped inflict it on others, both to maintain their own privileged status and because they had genuinely been conditioned to believe the method was beneficial. Students typically spent 2 to 4 years at Holloway Academy. When they finally left, they returned to their families as successfully corrected, quiet, obedient, showing no trace of whatever behavior had caused their parents to send them away. Their families were delighted. Holloway's reputation grew. More students were sent, more money flowed in, and Holloway continued to refine his method, documenting everything in detailed journals that he believed would someday be recognized as groundbreaking contributions to behavioral science. What Holloway's promotional materials didn't mention, what the satisfied parents never saw, were the casualties. Between 1868 and 1885, 47 students passed through Holloway Academy. 33 were released as successfully corrected. 12 were transferred to asylums after suffering complete mental breakdowns. 2 died while enrolled. The official records listed these deaths as illness and accident. The truth was more complicated. Thomas Brennan entered Holloway Academy in February 1879 at age 14. His parents had sent him because he showed, in their words, unnatural sensitivity and an obsession with poetry and art rather than business and practical matters. Thomas kept a secret journal during his time at the academy, hidden inside a hollowed-out book. The journal documented his progressive psychological destruction. The early entries showed a creative, sensitive boy trying to understand why his parents had abandoned him to this place. Later entries became increasingly desperate, describing the isolation chambers, the constant criticism, the feeling that his mind was being disassembled piece by piece. One entry from April 1880 read, "They tell me my love of poetry is a sickness. They make me stand before the other students and call myself diseased. They ask me to list my failures. When I cannot think of enough failures, they add more. They say I am lying to myself, hiding my true defects. They will help me see the truth about how broken I am. Sometimes I believe them. Sometimes I feel broken beyond repair." By January 1881, Thomas's entries had become disjointed, confused. He no longer wrote about poetry. He wrote only about his faults, his failures, his gratitude that the academy was fixing him. Then in March 1881, there were no more entries. On March 15, 1881, Thomas Brennan's body was found hanging in one of the third-floor isolation chambers. The official report stated he had died by suicide during a temporary mental derangement. Dr. Holloway wrote to Thomas's parents expressing sympathy for their loss, and noting that such tragic incidents sometimes occurred with deeply defective personalities who resisted reconstruction. Thomas's journal was discovered by a staff member and given to Dr. Holloway, who read it with clinical interest and then locked it in his files. Years later, this journal would become crucial evidence of what actually happened at Holloway Academy. But in 1881, Thomas's death was quietly buried. His family, ashamed and grief-stricken, did not pursue questions. The academy continued operating. More students arrived, desperate parents willing to pay any price to fix their wayward children. The second death occurred in 1883. A girl named Rebecca Martin, age 16, died of what the official report called sudden illness. Students who were there later testified that Rebecca had been subjected to the silence treatment for 4 months after refusing to denounce her desire to attend college rather than marry. During those 4 months, she had been fed minimal rations, kept in isolation most of each day, and treated as invisible by the entire school. When she finally became ill, she was so conditioned not to speak that she didn't report her symptoms. By the time staff noticed she was seriously unwell, pneumonia had advanced too far. She died in the third-floor isolation chamber, alone, never having been acknowledged as human again after her refusal to submit. Her parents were told she had been successfully corrected and was being prepared for graduation when an unfortunate illness struck suddenly. They believed this because they needed to believe that sending their daughter to this place had not been a terrible mistake. But students who had been at the academy during Rebecca's decline knew the truth. Several of them would later testify that Rebecca's death was the moment they realized they were not in a school but a prison, that what was being done to them was not education but systematic destruction. Despite these deaths, or perhaps because they were successfully hidden, Holloway Academy's reputation continued to grow through the 1880s and 1890s. Dr. Holloway became a sought-after expert on behavioral correction. He gave lectures at Yale and Harvard. He published papers in medical journals describing his methods, though he carefully omitted the most brutal details. In 1887, he published a book titled The Science of Behavioral Reconstruction, a method for the correction of deviant youth. The book was widely praised. Reviewers called it groundbreaking, visionary, scientifically rigorous. Several other institutions adopted modified versions of the Holloway method. Dr. Holloway was invited to consult on the design of reform schools, juvenile detention facilities, and even some private sanitariums. His influence extended far beyond his own academy. Thousands of young people across America were subjected to techniques he had developed and popularized. What none of these admirers knew was that Holloway's published work was carefully sanitized. His book described therapeutic isolation and structured behavioral modification, without mentioning that isolation meant sensory deprivation in windowless cells, and behavioral modification meant psychological torture designed to completely destroy and rebuild a young person's identity. Holloway's private journals, which he kept locked in his study, told a different story. In these journals, he was honest about his methods and their effects. He documented the breakdowns, the suicides, the students who became shells of themselves. But rather than viewing these outcomes as failures of his method, he classified them as evidence that those particular students had been too defective to be successfully reconstructed. He wrote, "Some personalities are so fundamentally flawed that they cannot be rebuilt. These unfortunate cases must be identified early and transferred to permanent institutional care, where they can be prevented from contaminating society. This is not a failure of the method, but rather the method's value in identifying the truly irredeemable." This chilling logic allowed Holloway to continue his work without guilt. When students broke under his method, when they lost their minds or killed themselves, he viewed this as proof of their defectiveness, not evidence that his techniques were fundamentally harmful. By 1895, Holloway was at the height of his career. Holloway Academy had a waiting list. Prominent families competed to enroll their children. Dr. Holloway was mentioned as a candidate for prestigious academic positions. His wife, Catherine, had given him 2 children, a son, Edmund Jr., and a daughter, Margaret. Edmund Jr. was being groomed to take over the academy eventually. Margaret, however, was different. Born in 1875, Margaret showed an unusual compassion and curiosity about the Academy's students. As she grew older, she noticed things that troubled her. She noticed how different students looked when they first arrived versus when they left. She noticed the strange, mechanical quality of successfully corrected students. She noticed the third floor that she was never allowed to visit. When she asked her father about these things, he told her she was too young to understand the complexities of behavioral science, that she should focus on her own education and leave such matters to those qualified to judge them. But Margaret didn't stop noticing, and as she grew older, she began to realize that what her father called science was actually something far darker. In 1898, Margaret Holloway was 23 years old. Her father had recently suffered a mild stroke and was beginning to discuss succession planning. Edmund Jr. was being prepared to take over the Academy's operations, while Margaret was expected to make a suitable marriage and have nothing to do with her father's work beyond supporting it publicly. But Margaret had other plans. She had convinced her father to let her work as what she called a student counselor at the Academy, arguing that a woman's gentle touch might benefit the students' emotional well-being. Dr. Holloway, confident that his daughter would only see what he wanted her to see, agreed. What he didn't anticipate was Margaret's persistence and her intelligence. She began by simply talking to students, particularly those who had been recently corrected and were preparing to leave. She noticed patterns in how they spoke, how they moved, how they responded to questions. They reminded her of actors performing a role, constantly monitoring themselves to ensure they were displaying proper behavior. When she asked them about their time at the Academy, they recited the same phrases her father used in his lectures. When she tried to get them to speak spontaneously about their feelings or their interests, they struggled, as though such individual thought was foreign to them. Margaret also paid attention to the students who were struggling, those still in the deconstruction phase. She observed correction sessions and was disturbed by what she saw. Teenagers being systematically humiliated, told they were fundamentally defective, broken down emotionally until they would agree to anything just to make the criticism stop. She began to understand that what her father called behavioral correction was actually psychological abuse, and what he called successful reconstruction was actually the creation of traumatized people so conditioned to obey that they had lost their capacity for independent thought. In the spring of 1899, Margaret made a decision. She would document what was actually happening at Holloway Academy. She began by befriending the Academy's longtime secretary, Mrs. Elizabeth Winters, who managed her father's files and correspondence. Mrs. Winters had worked at the Academy for 15 years and had witnessed everything. She was deeply troubled by what she had seen but had felt powerless to act. When Margaret confided her concerns, Mrs. Winters made a choice. She would help. Over the next year, working in secret, Margaret and Mrs. Winters copied documents from Dr. Holloway's private files. They copied his journals detailing his methods. They copied correspondence with parents of students who had died or been institutionalized. They copied medical records showing the use of drugs to sedate resistant students. They copied budgets showing that the Academy was extremely profitable, with most expenses going to Dr. Holloway's salary and lifestyle rather than student care. They built a comprehensive record of 30 years of systematic child abuse, disguised as education. By December 1900, they had everything they needed, but they still needed a strategy. Exposing her own father would be devastating to Margaret personally, and would likely result in fierce resistance from the medical establishment that had embraced Dr. Holloway's work. They needed to find someone outside the family who had the authority and credibility to make these revelations matter. They found that person in Dr. James Morrison, the new state medical examiner for Connecticut. Dr. Morrison had recently been appointed after campaigning on a platform of reforming institutional medical care. When Margaret and Mrs. Winters approached him with their evidence in January 1901, he initially didn't believe them. But as he read through the documents, as he saw the pattern of abuse documented in Dr. Holloway's own words, his skepticism turned to horror. Dr. Morrison brought the evidence to the Connecticut State Legislature in February 1901. The ensuing scandal was immediate and explosive. Newspapers ran headlines, "Torture disguised as education," "Prominent psychiatrist accused of child abuse," "Yale Graduates Academy of Horror exposed." Dr. Holloway, confronted with his own documentation, at first tried to defend his methods. He argued that everything he had done was scientifically justified, that some discomfort was necessary for behavioral correction, that the students who had been harmed were simply too defective to be helped. But as more details emerged as former students were interviewed and described their experiences, public opinion turned decisively against him. The Connecticut legislature ordered a full investigation. Investigators interviewed 73 former Holloway Academy students who could be located. The testimony they provided was devastating and remarkably consistent. Students described systematic psychological torture, isolation, humiliation, and conditioning that had left them with lifelong trauma. Many reported that even years after leaving the academy, they struggled with anxiety, depression, and difficulty thinking independently. Several admitted they had become exactly what their families wanted: quiet, obedient, and empty. The investigators also discovered that Thomas Brennan's journal had been preserved in Dr. Holloway's files. When the journal was made public with Thomas's own words describing his progressive psychological destruction, public outrage reached new heights. In April 1901, before the investigation was complete, Dr. Edmund Holloway committed suicide in his study at age 72. He left a note claiming he was the victim of a conspiracy by those too small-minded to understand visionary science. His death eliminated the possibility of criminal prosecution, but it didn't stop the investigation. The academy was immediately shut down. Students still enrolled were sent home. The building was seized by the state, and a broader inquiry began into other institutions that had adopted similar methods. The investigation's final report, published in September 1901, was damning. It concluded that between 1867 and 1901, at least 73 children had been subjected to systematic psychological abuse at Holloway Academy. Of these, 12 had been institutionalized with severe mental illness. 2 had died, and the remainder showed varying degrees of long-term psychological damage. The report explicitly stated that Dr. Holloway's methods had no scientific merit and constituted deliberate torture. The Holloway method scandal had significant impacts on institutional reform in Connecticut and beyond. It led to the creation of the first state-level oversight of private boarding schools and the establishment of basic rights for students in institutional settings. But perhaps more importantly, it became a cautionary tale in psychology and psychiatry about the dangers of unchecked power over vulnerable populations and the ease with which abuse can be disguised as scientific progress. Margaret Holloway spent the rest of her life advocating for patient rights and institutional oversight. She never married, dedicating herself instead to ensuring that what had happened at her father's academy could never happen again. When she died in 1957 at age 82, she left a foundation that continues to monitor institutional treatment of children and adolescents. The Holloway Academy building stood empty for decades, too associated with its dark history for anyone to want to purchase or use it. It was finally demolished in 1975. Today, a small memorial stands on the site, bearing the names of the 2 students who died there and acknowledging all those who were harmed. The methods Dr. Holloway used are, unfortunately, not entirely historical curiosities. Elements of them appear in various modern contexts. Conversion therapy programs that attempt to change sexual orientation or gender identity, troubled teen industry facilities that use isolation and humiliation, and any institutional setting where those in power believe they have the right to completely remake someone's identity against that person's will. The question raised by the Holloway method remains urgent. Where is the line between education and indoctrination, between correction and destruction, between helping someone change and forcing them to become someone else entirely? Remember Holloway Academy. Remember the children who were told they were broken and needed to be remade, who were systematically tortured until they agreed that their thoughts, feelings, and identities were diseases that needed to be cured. Remember that institutional power, when unchecked, and science, when divorced from ethics, can create horrors while claiming to provide solutions. If this story disturbs you, if you recognize patterns that still exist today, subscribe for more documentaries about hidden institutional abuse. And if you or someone you know is in a program that uses isolation, humiliation, or behavior modification to force personality change, understand that these methods are not therapy. They are abuse, the same abuse that destroyed students at Holloway Academy between 1867 and 1901. Some methods deserve to be erased from history, not refined.